In February 1889, a small notice appeared in the Cincinnati Enquirer, a call for medical aid to a woman in rural Kentucky who hadn't left her bed in 17 years. It mentioned her size, her strange condition, and a history of childbirth that baffled physicians. But what the paper didn't print, what the townsfolk whispered instead, was that men had been visiting her lonely farmhouse for years, and that the county ledgers listed more births than any midwife could explain, with no record of where those children went. Before we dive into the story, if you're drawn to forgotten histories and the voices silenced by time, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. I also love knowing where you all are watching from. What part of the world are you in right now? Comment down below and stay with us as we uncover more stories that deserve to be remembered. Now let's continue with the story. The advertisement appeared in the medical classified section, wedged between notices for patent medicines and announcements of new surgical techniques. Dr. Samuel Pritchard had composed it carefully, choosing words that would intrigue specialists without revealing too much to casual readers. He sought consultation regarding a female patient of unusual circumstances, he wrote, one whose condition presented challenges beyond his rural practice's capabilities. The woman weighed approximately 400 pounds and had been completely bedridden for nearly 2 decades in the mountainous regions of eastern Kentucky. What made Dr. Pritchard place this advertisement wasn't the woman's size or her immobility, though both were remarkable. It was the notation he'd discovered in fragmented medical records kept by a midwife who had since left the county. 30 births, 30 separate deliveries over 15 years, all attended in the same remote farmhouse, all involving the same bedridden patient. The midwife's records were sparse, containing only dates and brief notations about each infant's condition at birth. Most were listed as healthy. Some were marked with a simple notation, "Arrangements made." Dr. Pritchard had arrived in Pike County only 6 months earlier, establishing his practice in a region where medical care remained scarce and professional standards barely existed. The territory stretched across steep hollows and isolated ridges where families lived miles from their nearest neighbors, where roads became impassable in winter, and where the outside world's laws and customs held little sway. He'd expected to encounter poverty, illness, and the accumulated consequences of generations living beyond proper medical attention. He had not expected to stumble upon evidence of something that defied not only medical possibility, but moral comprehension. The Cincinnati Enquirer represented his best hope for finding someone with expertise in unusual obstetric cases, someone who might help him understand what he had discovered. The newspaper circulated throughout Ohio and into neighboring states, reaching physicians at teaching hospitals and medical societies. Pritchard had deliberately avoided mentioning the most disturbing aspect of his findings in the advertisement. He needed expert consultation, but he also needed discretion. The question of where 30 children had gone and why county records showed only 3 surviving past infancy required investigation beyond medical expertise. In the weeks following the advertisement's publication, 3 responses arrived at Pritchard's office, forwarded through the newspaper. 2 came from physicians curious about the medical aspects of extreme obesity and prolonged bed confinement. The 3rd came from someone whose credentials suggested experience with cases where medicine intersected with criminal investigation. That respondent asked a single question that confirmed Pritchard's worst fears. "Have you examined the property for evidence of the children?" Her name was Delilah Marsh, though few people outside Pike County would ever learn it. Birth records from Letcher County showed she'd entered the world in 1847, the 4th daughter of a farming family scratching survival from rocky hillside plots. By 1865, she'd married Ezra Marsh, a man 20 years her senior who owned a modest farmstead in a hollow so remote that census takers sometimes missed it entirely. The marriage produced 2 children in quick succession, both of whom survived to adulthood and eventually left Kentucky for factory work in Cincinnati. The transformation that would define Delilah's existence began in 1871. According to a diary kept by a traveling preacher who visited the Marsh property that year, he described her as a woman of normal size who suffered from persistent swelling in her legs and abdomen ailments that worsened throughout that winter. By the following spring, she could no longer walk unassisted. By autumn of 1872, she had become completely bedbound, her weight increasing dramatically, as mobility became impossible. Ezra Marsh constructed a reinforced bed frame in the largest room of their small farmhouse, positioning it near the fireplace for warmth. What happened to Ezra Marsh remains one of the mysteries that later investigators could never fully resolve. He appeared in the 1870 census as head of household, but by 1873, his name vanished from all county records. No death certificate was filed, no property transfer was recorded. Neighbors who were questioned years later offered contradictory accounts. Some claimed he'd simply abandoned his incapacitated wife and moved west. Others suggested darker possibilities but provided no evidence. The land remained in Delilah's name, though she could neither work it nor leave the structure that had become her prison. The farmhouse itself stood at the end of a narrow trail that wound 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by dense forest that concealed it from casual observation. The building consisted of 4 rooms constructed from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a roof that leaked during heavy rains. By 1875, the property had fallen into visible disrepair. Yet someone maintained enough of the farm to keep Delilah supplied with food. County tax records show the property taxes were paid irregularly, sometimes years in arrears, but never defaulted entirely. A deposition given in 1890 by a woman who had worked as Delilah's occasional caretaker described the conditions inside. Delilah occupied the entire bed, which measured nearly 6 feet wide, custom built to accommodate her size. She could shift her upper body but lacked strength to rise or turn herself completely. The caretaker, whose testimony was obtained only after she'd moved to a different county, spoke of the overwhelming isolation and the strange atmosphere that pervaded the house. She mentioned visitors who came after dark, men whose faces she was instructed never to observe directly, and payments made in coins and goods that kept the household minimally functional. By the time Dr. Pritchard encountered Delilah in late 1888, she had spent 16 years in that bed, in that room, in that forgotten hollow. Her medical examination revealed not just the physical toll of immobility and obesity, but evidence of the repeated pregnancies that the midwife's records had documented. When he asked about her children, Delilah turned her face to the wall and spoke only 4 words that would haunt his investigation. They took them away. The pattern emerged slowly through fragments of testimony gathered years after the fact, when witnesses finally felt safe enough to speak. It began sometime in 1874, approximately 2 years after Delilah became bedridden. A man named Silas Hewitt, who operated a general store 12 miles from the Marsh property, started making regular trips up the hollow trail. He carried supplies, he claimed when asked, basic necessities for the invalid woman whose husband had supposedly departed. Nobody questioned this publicly, though privately several people noted that Hewitt's visits occurred with suspicious regularity, always in evening hours, always alone. Within a year, other men joined this rotation. A timber surveyor named Jacob Fairchild, a merchant from the county seat who dealt in livestock, a railroad agent who passed through the region quarterly on business. The visits established a rhythm that residents of nearby properties learned to recognize without openly acknowledging. Witnesses who later testified described seeing horses tied outside the Marsh farmhouse at odd hours, sometimes 2 or 3 on the same evening, the animals waiting patiently while their owners conducted whatever business drew them up that isolated trail. The economic arrangements that sustained this system were never fully documented, but evidence suggests a crude form of organization. The occasional caretaker who had worked at the property mentioned seeing a ledger book kept in a drawer, though she claimed inability to read its contents. Dr. Pritchard later discovered receipts showing regular payments from multiple sources to cover property taxes, firewood, and basic provisions. The amounts suggested coordination, as if several individuals were pooling resources to maintain the household's minimal functionality. What made the situation possible was the profound isolation that characterized eastern Kentucky during this period. Families lived separated by miles of difficult terrain, connected by trails that became impassable during winter months and spring floods. No telegraph lines reached this deep into the mountains. Mail delivery was sporadic and unreliable. The county sheriff was stationed 40 miles away and visited the remote hollows only when summoned for clear emergencies. In this vacuum of authority, arrangements could persist for years without outside intervention. The social dynamics of the region also played a role. Poverty was endemic, and survival often required compromises that outsiders might judge harshly. Women had few options for independence or protection. Delilah's complete immobility and lack of family support made her uniquely vulnerable while simultaneously creating a situation that certain men found exploitable. The community's silence wasn't necessarily approval, but rather the learned helplessness of people who understood that challenging powerful men brought consequences they couldn't afford. A diary entry from 1882, discovered in the papers of a now-deceased schoolteacher, hints at the scope. She wrote of hearing rumors about the woman in the hollow, about how certain men spoke of her in hushed tones at the general store, about how wives looked away when those particular husbands announced evening business trips. She noted her own fear of asking questions directly, of becoming entangled in something that felt dangerous to acknowledge. The final line of her entry captured the era's moral paralysis. We all knew something terrible was happening, but knowing and speaking are different kinds of courage, and we had only enough for one. By 1888, when Dr. Pritchard began investigating, at least 15 different men had made documented visits to the property over the preceding 14 years. The county clerk's office in Pikeville maintained birth records in leather-bound volumes, each entry recorded in careful script with date, location, and attending midwife. Dr. Pritchard spent an entire afternoon in that dusty room turning pages until he found what he was looking for. The first entry appeared in September 1874. Female infant, born to Delilah Marsh, attended by Prudence Kellum, midwife. The notation was unremarkable, except for one detail that would repeat across dozens of subsequent entries. Where the form requested father's name, someone had written a single word: unknown. 30 entries followed over the next 14 years. The spacing revealed a disturbing pattern. Delilah had given birth roughly every 6 to 8 months during her most fertile years, with only slightly longer intervals as she aged. The births occurred in all seasons, documented with the same sparse details. Prudence Kellum's name appeared on 27 of the 30 certificates. The remaining 3 listed a different midwife who had attended during a period when Kellum was reportedly ill. Every single birth certificate bore that same notation where paternity should have been recorded: unknown. Medical journals from the period provided context for understanding the physical horror of what these records represented. A bedridden woman of Delilah's size faced extraordinary dangers during pregnancy and delivery. Her immobility meant constant risk of bed sores, blood clots, and respiratory complications. Each pregnancy would have strained her already compromised circulatory system. The lack of proper prenatal care, the primitive conditions of that farmhouse, and the absence of any hospital facilities within reasonable distance made every delivery potentially fatal. Contemporary medical literature documented several cases of obese bedridden patients who had survived multiple pregnancies, though none approached the frequency seen in Delilah's case. A Philadelphia physician had published a paper in 1885 describing a patient who had delivered 8 children while bedbound over 12 years, noting that each subsequent pregnancy became more dangerous. He concluded that such repeated childbearing in these circumstances bordered on medical impossibility without maternal death. Delilah had endured 30 documented pregnancies in 15 years while weighing 400 pounds and unable to move. The physical mechanics made Dr. Pritchard's investigation all the more urgent. Delivery for a woman of Delilah's size required specific positioning and substantial physical assistance. The midwife couldn't have managed alone. Someone else had been present at these births. Someone with enough strength to help maneuver Delilah's body and support the delivery process. The caretaker's testimony confirmed this, mentioning that men were sometimes present during births, though she claimed not to know their identities. What haunted Pritchard most was a calculation he made one evening in his office. If 30 pregnancies had occurred over 15 years, and if human gestation lasted 9 months, then Delilah had spent the vast majority of her bedridden existence in various stages of pregnancy. She had become, in effect, a perpetual breeding mechanism, her immobility making escape impossible, and her poverty making refusal unthinkable. The men who visited knew she couldn't flee, couldn't report them, couldn't even stand to push them away. Yet none of this explained the central mystery that kept Pritchard awake at night. 30 births had been documented and officially recorded with the county. But when he cross-referenced those birth certificates with census records, school enrollment lists, and death certificates, he found evidence of only 3 children who had survived past infancy. 27 infants had simply vanished from all subsequent documentation, as if they had never existed beyond that single moment when their births were recorded in the county ledger. The 3 children who survived into documented existence were easy to trace. 2 daughters, born in 1874 and 1876, had been taken in by families in neighboring counties. Court records showed informal custody arrangements, the kind of loose adoptions common in rural areas where orphaned or unwanted children were absorbed into households that needed extra labor. Both girls appeared in the 1880 census under their adoptive families' surnames. The 3rd survivor, a boy born in 1879, lived with relatives of Delilah's original family in Virginia, located through correspondence Dr. Pritchard had initiated. The other 27 simply ceased to exist after their birth certificates were filed. No death certificates appeared in county records. No burial permits were issued. No church registries noted infant baptisms or funerals. Dr. Pritchard expanded his search to adjacent counties, thinking perhaps children had been placed for adoption beyond Pike County's borders. He contacted orphanages in Lexington and Louisville, institutions that sometimes accepted children from remote regions. None had records matching the dates and circumstances of these missing infants. Infant mortality rates in 1880s Appalachia were staggering, often exceeding 50% in isolated communities. Disease, malnutrition, and lack of medical care claimed countless babies before their first birthdays. Under normal circumstances, the death of infants born to an impoverished, bedridden mother would surprise no one. What made this situation different was the complete absence of any documentation. Even the poorest families typically buried their dead in family plots or church cemeteries. Even the most isolated communities maintained some record of deaths, if only through church registers or family Bibles. Dr. Pritchard obtained a list of every cemetery within 20 miles of the Marsh property. He visited 12 of them personally, examining headstones and speaking with caretakers who maintained burial records. Not a single infant grave could be connected to Delilah's missing children. The local churches, when contacted, had no records of infant deaths from that household. The pattern of absence was so complete it suggested deliberate concealment rather than mere bureaucratic failure. A former county official, now retired and willing to speak candidly, provided a particularly disturbing perspective. He recalled that during the 1880s, several birth certificates had troubled him because they seemed to document children who never appeared in subsequent county business. When he'd raised questions informally, he'd been told the babies had been adopted out or had died shortly after birth. But when he'd pressed for documentation, for death certificates or adoption papers, he'd encountered resistance from men whose positions made challenging them unwise. He'd eventually stopped asking, a decision that clearly haunted him years later. The mathematics were inescapable. If 27 infants had genuinely died from natural causes within days or weeks of birth, their mortality rate would have been 90%, far exceeding even the worst documented rates for impoverished Appalachian households. If they'd all been successfully adopted, the absence of any paperwork or subsequent trace defied the realities of how such arrangements functioned. The only remaining explanation was one that Dr. Pritchard found himself unable to voice openly, even as the evidence accumulated. Someone had been disposing of these children deliberately and systematically, and the birth certificates had been filed not as celebrations of life but as documentation of a crime occurring with such regularity it had become routine. Prudence Kellum had left Pike County in 1887, moving to her daughter's home in Tennessee, where she died 2 years later. Her belongings, including several trunks of personal papers, eventually made their way to the Tennessee Historical Society through a grandson who worked as a librarian. It wasn't until 1895 that a researcher cataloging donations discovered a small leather journal buried among household accounts and family correspondence. The journal's cover bore no title, but the contents documented something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. The entries began in August 1874, with clinical precision. Female infant delivered at Marsh residence. Weight approximately 6 pounds. Breathing normal. No visible defects. Paid $2 cash. The notation was followed by a single additional line. Child removed same evening by S.H. The initials appeared repeatedly throughout the journal, alongside others that Dr. Pritchard would later identify as belonging to men who had visited the property. J.F. appeared 11 times, R.B. 7 times. Each notation followed the same pattern: birth details, payment received, and then the chilling phrase that varied only slightly: child taken by, arrangements completed, or simply removed. What made the journal extraordinary was Prudence Kellum's gradual transition from clinical documentation to something approaching moral testimony. The early entries maintained professional detachment, but by 1878, doubt began seeping into her writing. Delivered healthy male infant today. Strong lungs, good color. They took him within the hour. I did not ask where. I have learned not to ask. The pronouns shifted as the years progressed, from specific initials to the collective they, as if Kellum found it easier to conceive of her employers as a unified entity rather than individual men whose faces she had to remember. By 1880, the journal entries included observations that went beyond medical details. The woman begs me to hide the babies, to take them away where they cannot be found. She weeps constantly now between the pains. I tell her I have no power to help her, which is true, but also cowardice. The entries revealed that Delilah had tried to resist, had pleaded for her children to be spared whatever fate awaited them. But her immobility made resistance futile. Kellum documented conversations where Delilah asked about previous children, whether they were alive, whether anyone knew their names. The midwife had no answers to offer. The journal contained 3 entries that stood apart from the clinical pattern. In December 1881, Kellum wrote about a birth that went wrong. Infant born with cord around neck, not breathing. Tried to revive for nearly an hour. Child died. They seemed disappointed. Took the body anyway. Said it was for burial, but I do not believe them. The notation suggested that even stillborn infants were subject to the same removal process, though Kellum didn't elaborate on why this disturbed her more than the removal of living children. In March 1883, another unusual entry appeared. Delivered twin girls today, both healthy and crying strong. The men argued about what to do with 2 at once, settled on taking both, paid me double. Delilah screamed so loudly I thought someone might hear, but we are too far from anyone who would come. The image of Delilah's screams echoing through that isolated hollow, unheard by anyone who might intervene, captured the complete abandonment of her situation. The final entries from 1886 and 1887 showed Kellum's resolve breaking. I cannot continue this work. What we are doing will answer to God, if not to man. Today I told them I would attend no more births at that house. They threatened me with exposure, said I was complicit in everything that had occurred. This is true. I am complicit. I have been paid for my silence and my service, but I can take no more money stained with whatever happens to those children after I turn away. The journal's last entry, dated November 1887, shortly before Kellum left Kentucky, contained just 5 words that confirmed Dr. Pritchard's darkest suspicions. I should have examined the property. The statement implied knowledge she'd avoided acquiring, evidence she'd chosen not to see. When Pritchard finally obtained permission to search the Marsh farmstead in late 1889, he understood what Prudence Kellum had been too frightened to confront, what she'd fled to Tennessee to escape knowing with certainty. Dr. Pritchard's first examination of Delilah Marsh in November 1888 had been purely medical, focused on understanding her physical condition and whether anything could improve her circumstances. But during that visit, while checking her vital signs and examining the evidence of her repeated pregnancies, he'd asked a simple question that changed everything. Where are your children now? Delilah's response, they took them away, had been delivered in a tone so devoid of hope that it suggested she'd long since stopped expecting anyone to care about the answer. Over the following weeks, Pritchard began collecting information systematically. He interviewed the caretaker, who had occasionally worked at the property, though she proved reluctant to provide details until he assured her that his interest was medical rather than legal. He visited the county clerk's office and documented the birth certificates. He spoke with neighbors who lived within several miles of the marsh hollow, piecing together the pattern of visitors and the timeline of events. Each conversation added fragments to a picture that grew increasingly disturbing. His correspondence with medical colleagues initially focused on the obstetric impossibility of what Delilah had endured. A professor at the University of Louisville Medical School responded with detailed analysis of the physical trauma such repeated pregnancies would cause, concluding that Delilah's survival itself warranted documentation in medical literature. But Pritchard's follow-up letter shifted to darker territory. He outlined the missing children, the absence of death certificates, and the systematic pattern of removal. The professor's response was brief and cautious. "You are describing something that requires legal intervention beyond medical consultation. Proceed carefully." The warning was warranted. Pike County's power structure included several men whose names Pritchard had connected to visits at the Marsh property. When he attempted to discuss his concerns with the county sheriff, he encountered polite dismissal. Infant mortality was tragically common, the sheriff explained. Informal adoptions happened constantly in poor communities. Without evidence of actual wrongdoing, what exactly did the doctor expect him to investigate? The conversation ended with a subtle warning. Stirring up old business involving prominent citizens could prove harmful to a physician trying to establish his practice in a new community. Pritchard understood the message but couldn't abandon what he'd uncovered. He began documenting everything in duplicate, keeping one set of records in his office and mailing copies to his brother in Ohio. He contacted the state medical board, providing a detailed report of his findings and requesting guidance. Their response acknowledged the troubling nature of his discoveries, but noted that medical boards lacked legal authority to investigate potential crimes. They suggested he contact law enforcement at the state level if he believed criminal activity had occurred. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. One of the physicians who had responded to his original Cincinnati Enquirer advertisement arrived in Pike County in February 1889. Dr. Marcus Holbrook had worked as a medical examiner in Philadelphia and had experience with cases where medical evidence intersected with criminal investigation. Unlike Pritchard's earlier contacts, Holbrook didn't dismiss the implications of the missing children. Instead, he asked practical questions about the property itself. Had anyone examined the grounds? Were there outbuildings or cellars? What about the surrounding forest? Together, they returned to the Marsh farmstead in late February, ostensibly for a follow-up medical examination of Delilah. While Holbrook conducted that examination, Pritchard walked the property with the deliberation of someone looking for evidence rather than admiring scenery. Behind the main house, he found the remains of a root cellar, its entrance partially collapsed. Further into the tree line, he discovered what appeared to be a burned-out structure, perhaps a shed or small barn reduced to charred timbers and a stone foundation. The property covered nearly 40 acres of heavily forested hollow. Searching it thoroughly would require time, equipment, and legal authority they didn't possess, but Holbrook's assessment was unequivocal. Based on medical evidence, testimonial accounts, and the pattern of missing children, probable cause existed to believe serious crimes had occurred on this property. He would personally contact the Kentucky Attorney General's office and request a formal investigation. Whether local authorities cooperated or not, the state needed to examine what had happened in this isolated hollow. That evening, Pritchard wrote in his journal a reflection that captured both his horror and his determination. "I came to this county to practice medicine, to heal the sick and ease suffering. Instead, I have discovered something that medical training never prepared me to confront. Tomorrow, I will do what conscience demands, whatever the cost to my practice or my safety. Some truths, once known, cannot be unknown." Understanding why the situation persisted for 15 years required examining the social fabric of eastern Kentucky during the 1870s and 80s. The region existed in a kind of temporal isolation where subsistence farming, timber extraction, and coal mining provided barely enough to survive. Families occupied homesteads separated by miles of mountain terrain, connected by trails that flooded in spring and froze in winter. A woman living 3 miles away might not see her nearest neighbor for weeks during harsh weather. In such conditions, what happened in one household remained invisible to others unless deliberately brought to light. The economic desperation created its own moral compromises. Women had virtually no independent means of support beyond marriage or family connections. A widow without relatives, an abandoned wife, or a woman too ill to work faced options that ranged from bad to catastrophic. Delilah's complete immobility put her in a category beyond even these limited choices. She couldn't farm, couldn't travel to relatives, couldn't seek work or refuge. The men who visited the property understood this vulnerability and exploited it with confidence born from knowing she had nowhere to turn. Power dynamics in rural counties concentrated authority in the hands of merchants, large landowners, and those who controlled access to resources. Silas Hewitt, whose initials appeared throughout Prudence Kellam's journal, owned the general store that supplied most families within a 15-mile radius. Challenging him meant risking access to goods purchased on credit that many families depended on to survive between harvests. Jacob Fairchild surveyed timber rights and had influence over who received contracts for logging work. The livestock merchant who visited the property determined market prices that could make the difference between a family eating adequately or going hungry through winter. Testimony gathered years later revealed the mechanisms of silence. A farmer who had expressed concerns about the marsh situation to his wife found himself suddenly unable to sell his timber at fair prices. A woman who had suggested to neighbors that someone should contact authorities from outside the county discovered that credit at the general store was no longer extended to her family. The message was clear and effective. Involvement brought consequences that struggling families couldn't afford. Survival required looking away, asking no questions, and maintaining silence even when conscience protested. The legal infrastructure offered no practical recourse. The county sheriff was elected by voters who included the very men implicated in the situation. His office was located 40 miles from the marsh property, over roads that were often impassable. Even if someone had filed a complaint, the sheriff would have needed to travel for 2 days to investigate, question witnesses who feared retaliation, and build a case against men who held economic and social power. The incentive structure guaranteed inaction. Investigating would anger influential constituents, consume limited resources, and potentially expose a scandal that would reflect poorly on the entire county. Ignoring it cost nothing. Churches might have provided moral leadership, but the region's religious landscape was fragmented across dozens of small congregations, many meeting sporadically in homes or temporary structures. Ministers were typically farmers themselves, holding services when agricultural demands permitted. They lacked the institutional authority or independence to challenge powerful community members. Several ministers who later gave depositions admitted they'd heard rumors about the woman in the hollow, but had rationalized inaction by telling themselves that intervening in matters they didn't fully understand might do more harm than good. Perhaps most telling was the testimony of women who lived nearby. Several described feeling deep unease about what they suspected was occurring but finding themselves unable to articulate clear accusations or take definitive action. One woman recalled lying awake at night thinking about Delilah Marsh, imagining the horror of her situation, but then facing the morning's overwhelming demands of feeding her own children, tending livestock, and managing a household that teetered constantly on the edge of failure. Concern for a distant neighbor couldn't compete with immediate survival needs. The few who attempted intervention met swift discouragement. A traveling preacher who inquired too persistently about the Marsh household found himself denied lodging at homes that had previously welcomed him. His questions marked him as troublesome, someone who threatened the uneasy equilibrium that allowed the community to function. Within weeks, he'd moved on to circuits in other counties, carrying his suspicions but lacking evidence or support to pursue them further. Dr. Holbrook's letter to the Kentucky Attorney General's office, sent in March 1889, laid out the evidence with prosecutorial precision. 27 documented births with no subsequent trace of the children, a bedridden woman who had been systematically exploited for 15 years, multiple men with documented connections to the property, a midwife's journal that detailed the removal of infants immediately after birth. The letter concluded with a request that carried weight precisely because it came from a medical examiner with experience testifying in criminal proceedings. This situation warrants immediate investigation by state authorities with forensic capabilities. The response arrived in April. A state investigator named Thomas Garland would travel to Pike County with authority to examine the property, interview witnesses, and determine whether criminal charges were warranted. His arrival in early May created immediate tension. Local officials who had dismissed Dr. Pritchard's concerns couldn't ignore a state investigator backed by the Attorney General's office. The county sheriff, previously reluctant to act, suddenly became cooperative, though his assistance carried the cautious quality of someone protecting his own interests. Garland began with the property itself. He brought 2 deputies and a surveyor to conduct a systematic search of the 40 acres. They started with the collapsed root cellar behind the main house. Excavating the debris revealed a space approximately 8 feet deep with stone walls and a dirt floor. The surveyor's measurements showed the cellar was unusually large for a modest farmstead, roughly 12 feet square. What they found in that dirt floor would later be described in court documents with clinical detachment that couldn't mask the horror. Multiple sets of infant remains buried in shallow graves without coffins or markers. The burned structure in the tree line yielded evidence of a different nature. Beneath the charred timbers, they found melted glass, fragments of fabric, and items suggesting the building had served purposes beyond simple storage. A tin box buried near the foundation contained papers that had somehow survived the fire. Among them were receipts showing payments to Prudence Kellum, correspondence between several men arranging visits, and a ledger documenting transactions that treated human reproduction as a business arrangement. Forensic examination of the infant remains proved challenging with 1880s technology. The county coroner, pressed into service despite his limited experience with such cases, could determine only that the remains were consistent with newborns and that several showed evidence of having been buried within hours or days of death. Whether they had been born alive or died during delivery, whether death was natural or induced, exceeded his ability to determine. The sheer number of burials, however, made innocent explanations impossible. Witness testimony began flowing once the physical evidence made denial futile. The former caretaker provided detailed accounts of what she'd observed. Neighbors who had previously claimed ignorance suddenly remembered troubling incidents. Most significantly, Silas Hewitt's clerk at the general store came forward with records showing regular purchases of items typically used for infant care. Items that were charged to accounts belonging to men who had no small children in their own households. The clerk had kept duplicate records of these transactions, apparently sensing they might someday become important. By June, Garland had enough evidence to recommend charges. 4 men were arrested, including Silas Hewitt and Jacob Fairchild. The charges varied based on available evidence. 2 faced charges related to the deaths of specific infants where circumstances suggested deliberate harm. Others were charged with conspiracy and exploitation of a disabled person. The legal framework of 1889 lacked specific statutes for many aspects of what had occurred, forcing prosecutors to adapt existing laws never intended for such circumstances. The arrests created upheaval throughout Pike County. Families divided over whether the accused men were guilty of crimes or simply participants in arrangements that, however distasteful, reflected the desperate realities of poverty and isolation. Some viewed the prosecution as necessary justice. Others saw it as outside interference in local matters that should have remained private. Several witnesses who had provided testimony to the state investigator found themselves ostracized by neighbors who viewed cooperation with authorities as betrayal. Through all of this, Delilah Marsh remained in her bed in that farmhouse, her physical condition deteriorating as the legal proceedings unfolded around her. Dr. Pritchard visited regularly, providing what medical care he could, but her body had endured too much for too long. When Garland interviewed her in June, she could barely speak above a whisper. Her testimony, recorded by a court stenographer, consisted of brief answers to direct questions. She confirmed the pattern of visits, the pregnancies, the immediate removal of infants. When asked if she had consented to any of this, she said only, "I could not stop them from coming. I could not protect my babies. What consent means for someone who cannot move, cannot flee, cannot defend herself." Delilah Marsh died on January 12, 1890, 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. Dr. Pritchard, who had been monitoring her declining condition, attributed her death to heart failure complicated by years of immobility and the cumulative trauma her body had endured. She was 42 years old and had spent the final 18 years of her life confined to a bed in that isolated hollow. The county provided a simple burial in a cemetery 5 miles from the property. Fewer than a dozen people attended. No headstone was erected until 1897, when one of her surviving daughters, now grown and living in Ohio, commissioned a modest marker that bore only her name and dates. Her death complicated the prosecution's case significantly. The two men charged with causing specific infant deaths now faced charges without the primary witness who could testify about circumstances surrounding those births. The defense attorneys argued that without Delilah's testimony, the prosecution couldn't prove the infants had been born alive, couldn't establish cause of death, and couldn't demonstrate that their clients had done anything beyond visiting an acquaintance in a remote location. The forensic evidence, primitive by later standards, couldn't conclusively prove murder rather than natural infant mortality in conditions of extreme poverty. The trial began in February 1890 and lasted 11 days. Testimony from Prudence Kellum's journal was admitted over defense objections, with the judge ruling that the midwife's contemporaneous records constituted reliable documentation, even though she had since died and couldn't be cross-examined. The caretaker testified about what she had witnessed, though defense attorneys successfully challenged portions of her account as based on assumptions rather than direct observation. The physical evidence from the property, the multiple infant remains found in the root cellar, formed the prosecution's strongest argument that something far beyond normal infant mortality had occurred. In the end, only 2 of the 4 men were convicted. Silas Hewitt received a sentence of 15 years for conspiracy to exploit a disabled person and for his role in the systematic arrangement that had sustained the situation. Jacob Fairchild was convicted of similar charges and sentenced to 12 years. The 2 men charged with causing specific infant deaths were acquitted due to insufficient evidence proving the babies had died from anything other than natural causes. The jury, composed entirely of men from Pike County and surrounding areas, deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdicts. Several jurors later indicated they believed all 4 men were guilty of something, but the law as it existed couldn't adequately address what had actually occurred. The sentences generated controversy that extended far beyond Pike County. Newspapers in Louisville, Cincinnati, and as far as Philadelphia covered the case, with editorials debating what it revealed about rural poverty, the vulnerability of disabled women, and the limitations of legal frameworks designed for different types of crimes. Some argued the convicted men had been punished too severely for what amounted to consensual arrangements in desperate circumstances. Others insisted the light sentences represented a failure of justice for Delilah and her missing children. Women's advocacy groups emerging in several cities during this period cited the case as evidence that laws needed to explicitly protect vulnerable women from exploitation. The 2 men who avoided conviction left Pike County within months of the trial's conclusion. One moved to West Virginia and died in a mining accident in 1894. The other relocated to Tennessee and lived until 1923, running a small business and never publicly discussing the trial. Silas Hewitt served 9 years of his sentence before being released for good behavior in 1899. He returned to Pike County but found himself unwelcome in the community that had once respected his business success. He died in 1902, largely forgotten. Jacob Fairchild died in prison in 1901, having served 11 years of his sentence. The 3 children who had survived Delilah's ordeal carried the weight of their origin throughout their lives. The 2 daughters, interviewed decades later by researchers studying the case, described growing up with the knowledge that their birth circumstances were whispered about, that people looked at them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. One daughter married and moved to Illinois, deliberately severing ties with Kentucky and raising her own children without telling them about their grandmother. The other never married and worked as a seamstress in Cincinnati until her death in 1948. The son, raised by relatives who tried to shield him from the truth, learned the full story only as an adult. He struggled with alcohol for years before finding stability working as a railroad clerk. None of the 3 ever returned to Pike County or the property where they had been born. Modern analysis of the case undertaken by forensic historians and criminologists in the late 20th century attempted to understand the psychological and social dynamics that had allowed such systematic exploitation to persist. Researchers identified it as an early documented example of what would later be recognized as human trafficking, though that terminology didn't exist in 1890. The case illustrated how poverty, isolation, and physical disability could combine to create conditions where a person became effectively invisible to protective systems that theoretically existed to help them. The Marsh property stood abandoned for decades after Delilah's death. The farmhouse collapsed during a storm in 1937. By the 1950s, Forest had reclaimed the cleared land, erasing physical evidence of what had occurred there. In 1982, a historical marker was erected on the road 3 miles from where the house had stood. The marker's text is carefully worded, noting that the location was the site of a significant case in Kentucky legal history involving the exploitation of a disabled woman, but omitting the most disturbing details. Local residents still refer to that stretch of hollow as Marsh Creek, though few remember why the name carries such dark significance. What happened to Delilah Marsh and her children represents more than historical tragedy. It stands as a reminder of what becomes possible when isolation, poverty, and the systematic failure of community and legal protections converge. Her story asks uncomfortable questions about how many others suffered in similar circumstances in remote locations where no doctor ever came to investigate, where no records were kept, where silence was maintained until everyone who knew the truth had died. If this story has moved you, if you believe these forgotten victims deserve to be remembered, click the like button and subscribe. Every subscription helps us continue investigating these hidden histories, bringing light to cases that powerful people once worked hard to keep buried. Share this video so others can learn what happened in that Kentucky hollow, so Delilah's suffering and the loss of her children are not forgotten. History's darkest chapters teach us the most important lessons about protecting the vulnerable, about speaking up when silence seems safer, about ensuring that isolation never again provides cover for such systematic cruelty.